What should I do when thinking is occurring too much during meditation?
The Buddha in the Dvedha Vitaka Sutta of Majjhima Nikaya explained that when he meditated before he was a Buddha, he also had thoughts. And he provides an interesting sharing. He shares on what he did when he had thoughts in meditation. The Buddha explains that he had two kinds of thoughts: the so-called wholesome thoughts and the so-called unwholesome thoughts. Wholesome thoughts are the thoughts of non-greed, non-hatred, non-ignorance. Unwholesome thoughts are those thoughts of greed, hatred, and ignorance. So when you meditate, you're supposed to be mindful of whether your thoughts are wholesome or unwholesome. And the Buddha continues, when he observed the wholesome thoughts, he didn't do anything at all with them. He let them be there. But when he noticed there are unwholesome thoughts, he was very careful to get rid of those thoughts. So the Buddha was very strict on unwholesome thoughts, and he did his best before he was the Buddha, because after he was the Buddha, there were no unwholesome thoughts anymore. But before he was the Buddha, when he noticed there is an unwholesome thought, he would do his best, he would do maximum to just get rid of it. The Buddha gives a simile for that in the Dvedaha Vitaka Sutta. What is that simile? The Buddha says it's like when a shepherd leads his whatever are those animals, leads his sheep, or like a cowboy leads his cows, and when he leads his cows around a land of someone else, and he sees that his cows are starting to graze the plants or the crop of the land of another one, then he immediately does his best to get those cows out of that land, because if the owner finds out, well, then the cowboy will be imprisoned and flogged and so on. So he doesn't want that. So he gets his cows away from the neighbor's land, and therefore achieves safety, therefore avoids danger. So in that same way, the Buddha explains that if he noticed that his thoughts are unwholesome in meditation, he would do his best, maximum, everything, so that he does not have those thoughts. He explains that he had noticed that these unwholesome thoughts are dangerous, therefore he doesn't want to have them. Whereas when he had wholesome thoughts, it seems that he examined and he found out that having wholesome thoughts, any amount, is no problem at all. So it seems that if you have wholesome thoughts in meditation, it doesn't matter. Okay? But if you have unwholesome thoughts, well, then you have to get rid of them immediately, because they're too dangerous. Okay, so now the real question is what to do with these thoughts. So if you have wholesome thoughts, or if you have unwholesome thoughts, first of all, you need to determine, is this a wholesome thought or is this an unwholesome thought? After you have determined it, it's really necessary to determine it. There's no way out of that. And then after you have determined it, you need to be mindful. So you mindfully observe, what is this thought doing? When you mindfully observe an unwholesome thought, in the ideal case, but there may be exceptions, it will disappear and you're free from it. If you observe an unwholesome thought, that will disappear. If you observe a wholesome thought, then it will actually remain, because mindfulness and wholesome thought are never in a clash. They have no problem. So you can maintain a wholesome thought while you are mindful, but you cannot maintain unwholesome thought while you're mindful. So if you're mindful and you have an unwholesome thought, then that follows that you're not mindful. So you need to apply different strategies so that you're mindful. And therefore, the unwholesome thought disappears. So we do not need to force ourselves or to be stressed or to be afraid or to be scared when there's an unwholesome thought. Instead, we just apply mindfulness and we observe it. Okay, so what is it doing? How is it doing it? What exactly happens? What are the other processes that interrupt this unwholesome thought? What are the intentions that power this unwholesome thought? What are the conditions that make this unwholesome thought possible? So we analyze, we examine, we research the unwholesome thought. That's why it will quickly disappear, because unwholesome thought is based on ignorance. If you apply mindfulness, well, that actually is the basis of wisdom. And when you apply wisdom, well, then that is not ignorance. It's like when you come into a dark room and you turn on the light. Well, then it is not dark. Either you have it dark or you have their light. So when you apply mindfulness, the mindfulness is like the light, whereas the unwholesome thought is like the darkness. As soon as you apply mindfulness properly, unwholesome thought disappears. If it is a wholesome thought, then that doesn't disappear. It doesn't have any reason to disappear. Now, what matters, however, in addition to this wholesome, unwholesome, and mindfulness, is what you determined for in the beginning of your practice. Did you determine in the beginning of your practice that you will be observing your mind? Well, then it's perfectly good to observe your wholesome, unwholesome thoughts. But if you determine something else, then that's a totally different story. If you determined in the beginning of your meditation to observe your breath, or to radiate loving kindness, or to concentrate on the white color or blue color or yellow color or whatever it is, or the qualities of the Buddha's teachings, Dhamma, or the community of monks called Sangha, well, then all kinds of thoughts are not exactly desirable. So what will you do then? In that case, you need to understand that you have primary object and you have secondary object. If you take your primary object, such as the breath, or the loving kindness, or whatever you have resolved for in the beginning of meditation, because in the beginning of every sitting, every walking, you make a determination. From now on, for 60 minutes, I will meditate on muscles and radiate loving kindness without any movement. From now on, for 60 minutes, I will meditate on breath while walking or while sitting. You can decide. From now on, for 60 minutes, I will consider the Buddha's qualities without any movement. As you wish. You must always make the determination in the beginning of all your meditation sitting sessions and your walking sessions, otherwise you will get into troubles. You must if you don't want to get into trouble. You don't have to if you don't care about troubles. When you meditate and you start to get a thought, be it wholesome or unwholesome, you remind yourself of the determination. Why am I sitting here? What am I doing here? What was my resolve? And you remember this determination. Okay, I actually decided to sit here to observe the breath. So if there's a thought, then that's not exactly what I wanted, and therefore you can easily return to your breath. If you do not make the determination, which you must, as I say, make, well, then there is no reason why would you not be thinking, because you didn't decide for anything. So why would you need to do anything? Determination is the necessary condition for successful meditation, especially if you still fall into thoughts. So as you meditate and you get a thought, you remind yourself of your determination and making the use of your strong determination that you remember you did in the beginning of your sitting or walking. You easily get rid of your thoughts. If you did not make your determination by a strong determination, if you just recite it in your mind and you just start, well, then it is not a strong determination, and therefore it will not help you much. The determination needs to be genuine. It needs to be mindful. When the determination is genuine, when it is mindful, then when you have a thought or when you have any other problem, such as pain, such as you hear noise, or you see weird things, because we meditate with eyes a little bit open, not closed, then you easily remind yourself of your determination and return back to your object, regardless what are the things that take you away from the focus. Now, regarding the primary and secondary object point, if you consider one object or one set of objects that you determined for in the beginning of your practice as your primary object or primary objects, and everything else as your secondary objects, then that has a very interesting advantage, very interesting benefit. What is it? Whenever you fall into your secondary object, you do not have to be angry with yourself, and you do not have to worry that you don't meditate, because it's your object. Anything that happens in the meditation in this way, with this attitude, will be actually part of your meditation practice. And therefore, all meditation practice, whatever you meditate, whether successful or unsuccessful, will actually be your happy time, because you will always be with your object. You will always be there with your object. You will never be out of your object. Well, because everything is your object. But still, you distinguish your primary and secondary object. And because you distinguish them, and because you're mindful, whenever it comes that you are at the secondary object, you mindfully observe it, you're curious, you analyze it, you study it, but when it becomes uninteresting or when it disappears, you return to your primary object. So we never jump from secondary object to a secondary object. No, that should never happen. We always go from primary object to a secondary object, and then from secondary object to the primary object. And then if another secondary object comes, well, no problem. So we happen to fall into the secondary object. It's okay. It's an object. And then when that becomes uninteresting or disappears, well, we again return to our primary object. So this is how we work. We always go from primary object to maximum one secondary object. And from that secondary object, we always return to our primary object. Otherwise, it may happen, which unfortunately is very common among meditators, that they go from secondary object to secondary object to secondary object. And when I ask them, so what did you do in meditation? They ask me, Venerable Sir, can you please help me with my meditation practice? And I say, so what do you do in your meditation practice? And they say, well, I'm thinking. I say, but what was the instruction for your meditation practice? Well, to observe my abdominal wall. And I say, so what do you do in your meditation practice? And they say, well, I'm thinking. And I have to go like this again and again. So what was the instruction? Well, I was instructed to observe my breath. And I say, so what do you do in your meditation? Well, I'm thinking. And then I'm wondering, like, why did they get the instruction? And then when I see, that even after 5 times asking them like this, they don't answer me that what I want to hear. I ask them, so do you ever observe your breath? And they say, well, yes, sometimes. But isn't that the core of your practice? When I ask you, what do you do in your meditation? Shouldn't you answer to me, well, I'm supposed to observe breath and sometimes I'm successful? That's the answer I should get. But that's exactly what I don't get. Why? Because they do not make determination in the beginning of the practice. So they don't know what they are actually doing. And they start meditating and they observe their secondary objects, instead of understanding that the point of the practice of that particular sitting or walking is the primary object. They forget it. They don't even know. So we need to be clear about what's the point of our meditation practice. And that's why, even if you have a lot of thoughts and you happen to be lost in thoughts for 59 minutes out of the 60 minutes, you always value that 1 minute when you are with your breath as the most valuable time of your meditation. And then when I ask you, what did you do in those 60 minutes? You actually tell me that you were observing breath, because that 1 minute is the main point of your meditation practice. So you need to say you observe your breath. You can add, well, but most of the time I was thinking. But at least I then believe that you take your object seriously, that you are able to distinguish your primary and secondary object, and that your intention is to be with your primary object, and not that you say, oh, well, I'm thinking. Thinking is not a problem. Problem is not being with your primary object. This will be difficult to understand. Thinking is not a problem. Problem is not being with your primary object. What does that mean? If you think, you are not with your primary object. But at the time when you are with your thinking, you can have the intention to return to your primary object. And when you have the intention to be with your primary object, then you have a chance that you will return to your primary object. If the intention to be with your primary object is missing, then the mind will be too weak to return to the primary object. You need to be strong. Not too harsh, though, because if you are too harsh, you will get a headache. So we need to be careful about that. But at the same time, we are not too weak. We do not allow all of the meditation to be just thinking, because we're not sitting there for thinking. Unless you resolve to observe the mind, then it is fine. So when we decide to meditate on breath, then we are with the breath. And anytime that we are not with the breath, we think of the breath. Oh, I'm not with the breath. I would love to be with my breath. But you don't force anything. You observe the mind, you observe the thought and see, okay, so is it already uninteresting? Is it still interesting? Is it still there? Has it disappeared? Okay, fine. Now it's gone, so I can return to my breath. So this is how you can deal with your thoughts. So you are not angry with your thoughts. You do not blame yourself for having thoughts. If you meditate on observing the body, it's perfectly fine having thoughts, but you need to be mindful. First, you distinguish wholesome, unwholesome thoughts, and then you observe them exactly what they do. If you, however, decided to meditate on with a different technique, for example, on the breath, on loving kindness, on muscles and flesh, on the 4 elements, on qualities of the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and so on, then you take your thoughts as the secondary object. So again, you're not angry with yourself. You don't blame yourself for having thoughts. But as you are with your thoughts, you always remind yourself, wait, I determined in the beginning of this session that I want to be with my breath, if you're resolved for breath. And then you allow the mind to return back to the breath by the power of the determination. The determination is like the seed that you plant in a good soil. And then you just have to water it. Water it means to sit down in meditation. If the determination is sufficiently strong, it will grow. If you protect it from the danger, well, then it will grow safely. And it may grow into a big tree and give a lot of very sweet fruits. So we do not blame ourselves for thoughts, but we are very determined to follow our object in the beginning of the practice. And when we have the thoughts, we are very mindful and we know what we want.